So everybody, let me introduce you my co-host and our host for the next a couple of presentation, Tameka Hill-Thomas.
Hello, everyone. I'm excited to be your co-host for this conference today. Really am excited for our new person, David Swanagon, to come and talk. So hopefully he'll be joining in a few minutes and we'll begin.
Hi, Ross. How are you doing?
Hi, David. I'm fine, thanks. Let me introduce you my co-host. It's Tameka Hill-Thomas, who will support you for your presentation. I see my assistant already gave you a co-host right, so you should now be able to share your screen and show us your presentation. Okay. So Tameka, who will introduce David? You?
I will.
Okay.
Hello, everyone. Now we're here at our next session. We have David Swanagon. Did I pronounce that correctly? Swanagon? Oh, you're on mute. I'm still on mute.
Okay. Yes, ma'am. That's correct.
Okay, great. And he currently works for PPG, and he is the global head of People Insights, Technology, and Process Excellence. Today, he's going to talk about the future of work and how it equals people plus machines. So we're really excited to see how the combination of people and machines really leads to the future of work for organizations. He's going to talk a little bit more how to leverage AI to optimize human capital performance. If you would like any questions, please don't hesitate to put them in the chat and I will bring them up as we see fit, and we'll have a short Q&A after the session. All right, David, I'm handing it over to you.
Okay, perfect. And thank you for the introduction. And this looks like a fantastic venue, a lot of talented people joining the call. And, you know, similar to other presentations that I do, I see everyone as a colleague and I learn from you as much as you learn from me. And please do reach out to me on LinkedIn if you want to collaborate or ask about other projects. So in terms of my project's title, this is really me. This is what I believe in. And I think it's what's driving the future of human resources, is that I believe human resources and the human-machine interface is what's going to change moving forward. So this formula of the future of work equals people plus machines, this is the leadership model that future chief people officers are going to have to operate within. So it's not simply leveraging your traditional HRIS system, but imagine an environment where you have a fully connected cloud-based application to where every single touch point an employee interfaces with has an AI element. And it's an enabling force into how they do work, how they interface with the company, and then also how they make decisions vis-a-vis data insights, and also looking at talent, the full talent lifecycle from hire to retire, not simply through a subjective lens, but anchored through data, process engineering, and technology. So in terms of today's agenda, I'm going to kind of go through three things, and I really want you to apply it to your environment and ask yourself the question, how does people analytics really help the CHRO make decisions from a business acumen sense? In my view, everything to do with the HR strategy really comes back to, four categories, and that's revenue, growth, margin, and reputation. So even though HR has specific things it's trying to achieve, if you really want to be successful from a business sense, it's about cascading the broader business strategy into those HR enablers. So everything I do is focused on revenue, growth, margin, and reputation, and how do you apply HR to those four categories. So we'll talk a little bit about some of the emerging trends in terms of leading machines. We'll evaluate the ethical AI implications and the data privacy element. This is something I don't see a lot of data scientists talking about as it relates to people analytics, but there's ethics, right? It's not simply GDPR, but how data is consumed in the business, whether we're talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion, intersectionality, or we're talking about who should receive promotions, design justice. There's all these things that have an ethical layer that sits outside of privacy. And I really do think that the people analytics function can be the leader for HR in terms of ethical decision-making. And then the last thing is just to kind of paint a picture of what the critical skills are for CHROs of the future. And my prediction is that I think that the chief people officer and the chief digital officer roles will merge over time. Okay, so kind of proceeding to some of these key trends. Now, in terms of moving forward, the first prediction, and I want you to think about how this would actually work, because this relates to the people plus machines formula. Imagine if the CHRO position and the chief digital officer position were one role, and you had an individual sitting in that position that was an engineer, understood neural networks, understood the data infrastructure that supports machine learning, and had full visibility in terms of the sales infrastructure, how marketing, supply chain, logistics, and IT supported the revenue model, and then how talent sits underneath that to enable customer interactions, as well as logistics and fulfillment. I do believe this is going to naturally happen over time as machines become, more embedded into the workforce. And that means that the chief people officer position is going to have new competencies. So today we might look for your traditional chief talent officer person or HR business partner person. But in the future, I think it's going to be a economist, data scientist, engineer that just happens to love people topics that runs both of those functions. The second thing is I do believe that the employee workspace will shift from a kind of two-dimensional landscape into a three-dimensional, highly interactive, dynamic perspective. So right now you have the physical work location, the company's headquarters, their offices, and then you also have the hybrid work location, which is people working from home, those kind of two spaces. And then when you overlay this metaverse concept, the entire ways of working and employee experience moves into a three-dimensional space. And from a branding perspective, how you ensure continuity and engagement when an employee is in the physical office, when they're in their home, or when they're connecting with the company through the metaverse, this is going to require heavy use of data and a really strong people analytics team that can understand how employees are engaging within those three spaces, where the gaps are, how generations differ in terms of which space they prefer, and how we can leverage those spaces for the future. The third one, and this is my prediction, is the bot as the hiring manager. And this is, again, this is just my personal opinion. I do see this happening in some more high-tech companies as well as oil and gas, is that for project-based work and for work that deals with consultants, I do believe that an automated bot could be the hiring manager and also the individual that assigns work and manages the productivity and kind of the PMO office for a certain set of initiatives. So I do believe over time, human beings could report to a machine, and that requires a certain set of competencies in terms of the head of HR, in terms of how do you ensure an employee experience that's positive when your boss is actually a robot. And I do believe that's coming for the future. And I know a lot of people listening to this might think this is, oh my gosh, this is not going to happen. But if you just look at some of the changes that have taken place in terms of blockchain, Internet of Things, IR 4.0, I do believe this is kind of the next evolution of the HR process. Now, the fourth one deals with the strategic workforce planning. A lot of companies have a more balanced build, buy, borrow composition when it comes to their headcount. And, for example, tech firms will be heavily reliant on university relations. So they'll have most of their headcount in the build phase. They'll hire college graduates and then, kind of teach them their base programming languages and build the talent over time. Some companies that are more manufacturing based, from a leadership perspective, they'll look to do direct hires versus building from within. So they'll buy the talent, and they're willing to pay a premium in terms of the comp ratio because they want that expertise in terms of how to manage process engineering and so forth. But in the future, I think it's going to shift to where you'll have a very small amount of direct hires that are buys, and these will be the highly experienced technical SMEs and the executives. The build will be technical employees, emphasizing statistics, your programming base, machine learning, and so forth. And then the borrow is where the mass of employees are going to be. And these are individuals that are added and removed from projects, multiple times. And I do foresee employees of the future working for multiple companies at the same time, just on different projects. And when you have a heavily consulting-based workforce, and bots as hiring managers in a three-dimensional workspace, and a CHRO that also does the chief digital officer role, what ends up happening is it's a very data-driven engineering environment. And a lot of you, I think, if you think about that compared to what your office is today, you go, wow, how does HR contribute using the tools and the processes we currently have in place? The last one deals with digital avatars. I do see this in terms of the NLP and kind of convergence between natural language processing and these convoluted neural networks where they can do facial expressions, that eventually the machine will be able to mimic your behaviors, at least some of the more transactional behaviors, during non-working hours. So based on how you work during the day, how you respond to emails during the day, the machine will make decisions for you during non-working hours to keep you as productive as possible. Crazy world, to be sure. So if we proceed to kind of the CHRO of the future, like I said, I think it's more of an iceberg, and you're going to have 25% of the activities, against a rough estimate, that's dealing with your traditional hire to retire cycle. So CEO succession and board engagement, your talent management activities, and then, being an HR business partner for the other C-levels. I would say most Fortune companies I've worked with, it's reversed, 75%, sometimes 90% is traditional HR activities with only a small amount of data-driven insights. I do think that's going to flip over time, where you'll see that most of what the head of HR does is strategic workforce planning, the Six Sigma business process design engineering, and then managing a portfolio of machines vis-a-vis neural networks and ML operations and so forth. I also think this will mean IT cost of ownership and the DevOps perspective that usually sits within IT will become part of the CHRO's agenda, optimizing licenses and the various cloud-based applications that help employees connect with machines and with each other in an efficient way. But the key takeaway with this, and this is my prediction, is that the CHRO and the chief digital officer positions will merge. And that will create a totally different environment in terms of how employees interact with each other and with the AI application supporting the company's revenue model. So in terms of the metrics that matter, this is something I wanted to apply how you could look at metrics and how those translate into earnings per share impact. And this is some of the conversations that can happen when people analytics focuses on business outcomes and gets away from more of the subjective views or the standalone HR impact that you might see using traditional activities. So what I'm showing you below is kind of an average that I've seen at multiple companies. So it's not simply just PPG, it's multiple companies. And the percentages you see at the left deal with earnings per share. And then on the right-hand side, this kind of tells you the degree of sophistication of Fortune companies. So, how much of their processes that support this metric are automated, leverage data and data-driven insights, and how much of it is more of the subjective HR business partner, facts on the ground, their expertise handling the issue. And so new hire attrition, this is a great example, especially within a manufacturing environment. If you look at individuals when they leave, the analysis we've done, it's usually day 1, day 30, and day 90. Those are the 3 moments that matter. And if you mishandle those, new hire attrition is significantly larger than the Gartner benchmark. And if you correlate that, or if you just extrapolate the cost to replace someone whether it be finding them, background checks, medical checks, onboarding. It's usually around 5% of earnings per share for a mid-size, Fortune 200 company. Now, imagine if the CEO could tell investors in an earnings call, I'm going to improve earnings per share by 5% this year. If the investors believe them, the stock price would significantly increase. But it's very rare for the CEO to think about HR in terms of earnings per share. It's usually a support center. But these metrics, and there's only 3 as examples, there's a number of HR metrics that can be directly connected to profitability. Like I said, revenue growth, profitability, and reputation. Learning velocity is the same thing. What we've seen in our analysis is it's looking at new learning and critical skills. It's not simply, your traditional competency maps, but it's looking at how often employees are learning new skills, applying them to new situations, and then using spaced learning and spaced retrieval to drive retention. If they do that correctly, project delivery is faster, timelines are faster, budget overruns are less, and it has a positive effect on earnings per share. And then succession planning strength, again, a lot of companies kind of fudge with this, and I think everyone would admit that, is that, they might say they have 85% of top talent in critical roles, but the, criteria they're using to determine what top talent is highly subjective. And it's not linked to benchmark or external data or anything quantifiable. It's more what the senior executives think about the individual. But when you use a more data-driven approach and you compare it to industry benchmarks and you do the correlation analysis to revenue and profitability, it's a pretty significant impact, succession planning strength. So the point I'm making with this is it's a shift in thinking. How many of you have been in a meeting with the CHRO that speaks this way, that thinks this way, when they're talking about HR metrics? Some of you may, but the vast majority don't make that direct connection when they're talking about HR strategy and the value they're delivering to the business. Now, in terms of the maturity model, and again, it might be different, and I think this is what's so great about a collaboration. This is just my perspective in the industries and companies I've worked with. I typically have seen people analytics go through a 3 to 7 year maturity model, and it goes through 4 steps. So you start with the HR business partner, typically running the reporting function, and they're pulling stuff from the HRIS system. And it's dealing with trend analysis and KPI dashboards. And the key skill you're trying to build in terms of consuming data is just storytelling. Can you take some of the trends you see in the HRIS system and tell a story around it that helps an executive make decisions? Now, as you mature, the people that you place in roles, they transition from being HR business partners to more data scientists. And typically it's because you're building your backend data infrastructure. You might move from SQL Server to a broader data lake concept, like a Databricks or an AWS framework. And you start using Python and R programming and other technologies to do more advanced statistics. Now, when you do that, change management becomes a bigger deal because it's one thing to build super duper cool models. And I'm a total nerd, a geek in this area, so I love this stuff. But I've noticed that executives and decision makers, their consumption of the findings requires a skill to be developed. So if you build all this cool stuff, but you don't help executives consume it and learn how to consume it properly, then a lot of companies can remain stuck in this second phase, which is just the insights phase. Proceeding to the third step, you kind of move into more of this advanced stuff. And for me, this is what takes the longest because it deals with the data infrastructure, the backend data sets. You have to make sure you have a standardized data dictionary, that your configuration across all the HR platforms are centralized into an automated, efficient ETL process that moves all the data into one instance. And then from that, you can do cool stuff around neural networks, especially if you build your HR data set to a level that supports, big data, machine learning, and so forth. But once you move into this phase, this is where the people analytics team stops looking like an HR team at all. Most of the staff on this team are DevOps people, are the data engineers, architects, data architects, QA testers, service delivery managers, solution architects, and so forth. It basically becomes your traditional machine learning team you would see in IT. They just happen to work with an HR data set. Now, the challenge when you're in this stage is that HR doesn't have any growth opportunities for these individuals. People who are highly skilled in this space, they're not going to be put on the succession plan for the chief talent officer or the head of HR operations or the head of total rewards. It's just a different skill set. So, typically retention attrition is very high in this phase if you haven't connected these positions to the broader IT organization and created a really strong relationship with the CIO and the chief digital officer, because this talent just is capped in what they can do within the HR space, unless there's more areas for them to grow in the broader tech space of the company. And then the last piece is kind of this principal data scientist. This is where you're doing things that really requires deep SME knowledge. Most of the individuals in this space have PhDs, and they're part of peer-reviewed journals. And they really do know their stuff in terms of how to curate data sets, not for a single instance, but a portfolio that deals with machine learning. And the aggregates of machine learning findings are what are evaluated. And you're consistently trying to create a portfolio that is accurate and driving a chain of outcomes, whether it's from strategic workforce planning to learning and development, operational excellence, and then also the retention and recognition and engagement. All those machine learning models should be connected into a portfolio. And from this space, this is where the ethics become involved. So when I was at Saudi Aramco, they're lesser known because they don't advertise this, but that company is really, in my view, a tier one data science team. And they're within this space of prescriptive. And one of the challenges that company has is making sure they have robust ethics in terms of how decisions are made, because so much of what they do is data driven. And they've been able to connect all of their data sets, whether it be HR, supply chain, IT, finance, and so forth. So because everything's data driven, now the executives are really relying on these machines to influence how they make decisions. And there's an ethics involved in that. So that company in particular is spending a lot of time on this human machine interface and creating an ethical model that allows the executives to make the right decisions. But that's when you get to the very mature stage of data analytics. Here, this kind of tells you, at least in my view, kind of the 9 dimensions of what you're trying to build within people analytics. And the green box tells you whether or not the individual placed within this skill set would be a top talent. The blue box would be someone with an IT or technical background. And then the purple box would be, more your traditional HR professionals. The thing I wanted to highlight is that in the future, you'll see it's mainly IT talent that runs most of this stuff. And HR, even though it's an HR domain, has fewer of those individuals staffing on the team. And this is, I just think, the natural evolution of the future of work. And because of this, it really comes down to all HR business partners, anyone in talent acquisition, anyone who wants a career in HR really needs to learn, especially this middle stream of this data grid, is that if you don't understand how data is acquired, how it's curated, architected, and then how it's partitioned and put into a machine learning platform, you're not going to be able to run or serve as a senior leader of HR in the future. This is definitely a skill set or set of skills that everyone needs to develop. Now, this is the other thing, and I think this is super cool. It's another way to look at talent versus skills, the cross-section of it. So if you look at the vertical axis, this tells you the availability of talent in the market. And there's a lot of ways to look at this. You could do Talent Neuron, LinkedIn Talent Insights. We do a lot of web scraping to kind of overlay our traditional licenses to get a sense of critical skills. Other companies are using Eightfold. There's a lot of different platforms for this. But if you look at talent availability on the vertical axis, then on the horizontal axis, it's looking at how critical the skill is. And the one thing when you look at this grid is to think about the compensation that's tied to it. The more you get to the bottom right, the more the comp ratio is significantly above your market average, and the more competition you have, not only to place the individual, but to retain them on an annual basis. So when you have people, especially within the HR space, that understand Python, R, SQL, and they really understand how computer vision works, especially with engagement surveys, and how you can incorporate nonverbal communication cues into a broader understanding of meeting sentiment. And then a lot of this stuff connecting it to correlations of leadership assessments and other data-driven insights. Those skills are very difficult to acquire, and they're very difficult to apply within the HR domain. So if someone has that skill, they're going to demand a market premium, and you're going to have to retain them on an annual basis through a reevaluation of their comp and their structure and their contribution to the business. And I think one of the challenges, and I mentioned it on a previous slide, but if you look at my role or other counterparts, it's hard to keep this position, because someone with the skills to lead people analytics, they can also lead supply chain analytics or marketing analytics. It's the same skill set, same technology platforms, maybe a little bit different if you're dealing with sales. But for the most part, if someone is an advanced user of Java, C++, Python, SQL, and they know SageMaker and Databricks, they're high in demand across multiple positions. So from that perspective, CHROs have a really hard time keeping these folks. They have to compensate them well, and they have to make sure that their products are being fully embedded within the HR business partners, the shared service center, as well as total rewards and the chief talent officer. I do see that the two positions that seem to partner best with people analytics, number one is total rewards. There's a lot of cool stuff you can do to help offers and job architecture and pay grades and pay equity. There's just a lot of cool stuff you can do that makes that partnership data driven. The chief talent officer, and I would include diversity into this. There are things you can do from an analytics perspective to meaningfully improve the fairness and equity of a company, both from a pay and opportunity, and well as representation perspective. And there are layers and levels to how you can advance this perspective. So usually the head of people analytics, I think the three roles to focus on in terms of partnership is the head of diversity, the chief talent officer, and then total rewards. If you can get those partnerships working, a lot of these models and a lot of these skills that you see on this grid can be fully embedded. On the flip side, I think the position that creates the most friction and challenge is the HR business partner role. From what I've seen, those individuals typically, and I mean this respectfully, right, don't have the same digital fluency and data skills, but they have very deep, significant expertise of the business, and they're very strong in HR. So while they may not be data scientists, their skills are just as good, just within a different domain. And so they clash, right? The HR business partner believes what they believe is happening in the business, and they have their reasons for it. And the analytics person believes differently. And even though people talk about change management and they talk about collaboration, if we're honest, sometimes you just don't get along, right? And for me, I think it's the responsibility of the people insights team is to always remain objective, to always use data to advance an argument in an ethical manner, and then rely on the CHRO to handle the conflicts that will arise. And, a key message that I would deliver is that if everyone likes you, if you're the head of people analytics and everyone likes you, you're probably not doing your job very well, because there are situations where the data is going to demonstrate problems in the business. And if you're not able to articulate those problems, handle the pushback, and more importantly, not take it personal when people are upset, then I don't think you're serving the CHRO's purpose, especially in terms of delivering impactful insights. So shifting to here, this is just kind of another structure to think about. There's the customer-facing side versus the technology-facing side. And again, this relates to the future of work, and you'll see how people plus machines changes the way a people analytics team is typically staffed. In the earlier maturity stages, you'll see individuals that have, mainly HR business partners, and they're usually focused on SAP HANA or HRIS, kind of workday reporting. But if you move into more of the IT framework, then the technical facing positions, you're getting into the data engineering, the ETL process, the architecting process, and the data science space. And you're using one of the cloud providers, whether it's Azure or AWS, and you're starting to introduce TensorFlow and some of the more advanced machine learning platforms for coding. And then if you're introducing ML operations, you get into the service delivery perspective, and you have the QA, testers, and you're introducing Docker and Kubernetes and all this other stuff to improve the automation. And it's moving things from development to production and having, IT protocols for that. And it's very rare for an HR team to get to that level of sophistication. But if you can do it, and this is where the partnership with the CIO is important, because some CIOs will not give you the licenses and the access needed to build this kind of framework. But if you're able to convince the CIO, then you can create a tier 1 data science shop, both from an infrastructure and automation standpoint, but also from a skill set standpoint to respond to questions. And then the customer facing is on the consultancy space. You'll see I don't put an HR business partner in this model. And again, I mean this with absolute respect to the HR business partners, but people analytics consulting is different. And it really focuses on the solution architecture and the merger between data and operational excellence. So an IO psychologist and the solution architect is usually the folks that, at least in the orgs I'm a part of, deal with the front end findings for people insights. Now, this is the last slide, then happy to answer any questions. And this is something I'm super passionate about. And this is really around explaining to folks the difference between data privacy, which is very important. And a lot of individuals have been trained on Sarbanes-Oxley and GDPR, and that's great. But there's the ethical decision-making, and how the C-suite makes decisions using data matters. And I'll give you an example. We had a situation in a company I worked with, and they were doing their diversity reporting. And they used all these benchmarks, and Gartner was one of them. And it showed that representation was successful, very positive, comparing males versus females. So the company had a higher representation number than the market benchmark. And the CEO published this and used all this to kind of aggrandize the success of the program. When you dove deeper, you saw that most of the females were heavily concentrated within HR and finance. So there was a disproportionate amount of female leaders in HR and finance, and there was basically no female leaders in the CEO kind of succession roles that deal with sales, marketing, and the operations. So even though, from an overall perspective, the company was exceeding, market benchmarks on gender representation, on the roles that led to the CEO office, on the roles that mattered, it was grossly underperforming. And so this is an example of where the people analytics team has to be kind of the wet blanket in the meeting and say, yes, we're doing well overall. But in many respects, we're not doing well because we want to make sure that women are leaders across all of our key roles and not just concentrated in 2 positions. This is an example of the ethics that underlay data analytics, and it has nothing to do with data privacy and GDPR. But what I've found is that some individuals within this space have a really hard time speaking up when the data doesn't fit the narrative of the business, especially when it's a positive narrative. It could be that the company did really well on its employee engagement survey, but if you look at the standard deviation of scores across the teams, it's very high, and it means that it's really great to work on one team and it's awful to work on another team. But when you aggregate the 2 and average it, the overall score is positive. So a lot of people just choose to focus on the overall and then nothing improves. But I think in this position, it takes a personality that can say, overall score is great, but we have serious problems in the consistency of scores across teams. And that's what we should be focusing on. You know, overall gender representation is great, but there's too much concentration in HR and finance. And this is the ethics that I think people analytics can help lead and help the CHRO embed within the business. So with that, happy to answer any questions. Like I said, I love collaborating. So if anyone wants to reach out on LinkedIn on projects or anything like that, let me know, please.
Yes, we're going to open it up for questions now. So if anybody would like to speak, you can raise your hand. I saw a hand there. Let's see. Jake, please go ahead. I'm sorry, Jake, did you have a comment or a question? Please go ahead. If not, does anybody else have a question? Please go ahead. If not, I actually have a question to David. So David, in your experience, has it been very difficult for people to get out of the reporting phase to more of the analytics phase? Or has that required more like leadership change in order to get that done?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. And I think in my experience, it's been extremely difficult. And the reason for that is, is that people, you have to focus on 2 things at the same time, is that the creation of advanced reporting is usually one core piece, but that's the only thing people focus on. So they'll create something, and since they haven't dealt with the data consumption piece, it gets rejected. And then we revert back to the basic report. So a key part of people analytics strategy is the stuff you build and then the way it's consumed. And you have to have a very specific strategy for how to build competency around data consumption. And I think a good way to start this, at least what I've seen work, is pick a topic that you know it's going to be favorable. It's going to make everyone look good. Now, I know this sounds like politics because it is, but if you pick a topic that makes everyone look good and you introduce a more advanced concept that enhances how good they look, and you take that to the chief executive of that business, then you'll get someone that can evangelize your product. And they'll start consuming it more and more. So if you focus on areas, instead of focusing on weaknesses in the business, focus it on areas where people are doing really well, and then use advanced analytics to show how it's even better than they thought. And you'll get those partnerships and friendships. And then over time, you can start hitting them with the uncomfortable deep waters conversations. But I think where I've had challenges in the past is I started with the deep waters stuff, like, hey, we're struggling in this workforce plan or this critical skill. And even if the data is accurate, even if it's automated and says something real, they're not ready to consume it. So it just gets rejected, and then you revert back to a very basic report.
That's a good question. I just want to add with my personal experience. When I was at Ernst & Young in my prior role, it was an internal role. And one of the things that I was passionate about was upgrading their data system so that we can do more meaningful work. I actually proposed a new project and argued that I needed the data to be upgraded, the data lake, so that we have better access to all data as part of that project. So I managed to kind of get what I want by wrapping two projects together as one. And once I finished the project and I showed the results, and I showed all the data that we were using, because we had integrated all these different data sets, that really helped us as a team with our, promoting ourselves to do a new project. People got really excited that they saw data that they never saw before, related to all these HR questions that we have. And it allowed us to do higher level analytics that was not, we weren't able to do before. So I, personally recommend, try to, when looking at a project, to try to argue also that you're going to need all this data. Because once you have the data set up for that project, that data can be set up for other projects as well in the future. And so once people saw that, a lot of resources were brought in to automate and update our data on a regular basis because they thought it was so useful.
Yeah, I mean, that's fantastic. And you probably had a really strong partner on the tech side. And that is so true, because if you can build this data infrastructure and you have a strong technology partnership, people love this stuff. And if you get them excited about data, you can have a really positive impact on how the company operates, not just from a profit standpoint, but how employees are treated in the workplace. You can influence that with data. So I think that's a great story. Thanks for sharing that.
Thanks. So Jake had a question. He had a problem with his mic, so I'm gonna ask his question. How likely do you think the future of work will exist in the metaverse?
Yeah, so in my opinion, I think the metaverse is being delayed because it's predominantly run by one company and being influenced by one company. I do think that will change. I think that as you get more of a coalescence of tech firms that are introducing, a broader metaverse concept, I think a lot of companies are going to, strongly engage in it once they figure it out. And to me, you're seeing as the baby boomer generation exits the workforce, and the Generation X is actually very small relative to the baby boomers. But the Gen Y and Gen Zs are the most educated of any generation thus far. So I see the metaverse becoming the predominant way employees interact once it's firmly established. And then the second would be the hybrid space. So it'll be people working from home and interacting through the metaverse. And then companies might have a physical location for their corporate university and for their more group-based events. But I see the corporate headquarters model totally change.
Sound like?
Yeah.
Great. So I think we are at time. I'm sorry, Brian, I wasn't able to get to your question. I strongly suggest you send a note directly to David for your question, and I'm sure he'll be able to answer it, because I think we need to go ahead and go straight to our next session. Am I correct, Ross?
Thank you, everybody. Really appreciate the time.